the light bulbs go off in his eyes.
Is the piece that connects everything.
We'll solve a problem that you would not be able to solve otherwise.
It's on the motherboard, like it's the central processing unit.
Think about this kind of writing as almost a kind of practice.
Trusting that the story was enough.
How can you create a meaningful message?
The audience has built that sense of anticipation, and they're ready to process that as part of the narrative.
Actually, the story of our work is transforming people's lives.
And I'm hoping to do this by telling you a story.
Hi, my name is Giles, and I'm a graphic designer. And I do a lot of work with research groups, helping to prepare funding applications, doing layouts, preparing diagrams. And I also work on the dissemination side of research as well. So making diagrams for publications, but also making kind of graphics for sharing on social media, more sharing things towards the general public. So I wanted to make this point that we're all designers. Whenever we make something as simple as a Word document or a website or more complex graphics such as scientific graphics, we're always designing, we're always making those decisions about what colors to use, what typefaces to use, and those kind of design elements can communicate on a conscious or a subliminal level. So it's good to have control over those elements as much as we can. The term graphic design didn't really exist before about the middle of the 20th century. And the type of work that we call graphic design now was simply referred to as commercial art. So graphic design really is art designed to serve a particular purpose, as opposed to what we call art, which it supposedly exists for its own sake. We've already seen presentations on data visualization, knowledge mobilization, and communication, and the roles that they play in the kind of storytelling process of disseminating research results. So where does graphic design sit in this diagram? Well, I see it as being useful at all these different levels. So it's useful directly to researchers, for example, creating diagrams for publications, but also useful in the communication and knowledge mobilization processes. Let's talk a little bit about graphic design in the kind of storytelling process. So I'm going to talk here about two types of graphics. Graphics that tell the story of a whole research publication. And here we can think of something like a graphical abstract, which would be aimed more at people in the field. And then infographics, which are more popularization of a research result that would be aimed more at the general public. And then there's graphics that explain one element or part of a story, such as experimental setups and research protocols and design and specific results of research. So with a graphic, we always want to direct the eye and control the reception of information. So if you think about a graphic as being like a story, then it has a kind of opening, it has a kind of body and a conclusion, and it should be evident to the person reading it that what the thread is of that story. Graphics relate to the emotive and subjective aspect of storytelling that we've already talked about in this summit, and you want to have control over that rather than those elements just being used in a kind of unconscious way. What are the elements of graphic design? Well, you could make many lists here. This is just my list of the things that I feel are the kind of key elements when designing a graphic. They are composition, which is, roughly speaking, the spatial organization of elements in space, which is normally two-dimensional space. Color, typeface, shape, shapes of objects, which can be hard, soft, simple, complex, etc., and texture. And by texture, I would be talking about, say, the difference between a photograph and a graphic like a silhouette, for example, which doesn't really have any texture. Here's some principles for graphic design storytelling. You should reduce the cognitive barriers for perception, because a graphic for a research publication is inherently often quite complex. Then you need to lower those cognitive barriers so people can find a way into the graphic and then can find their way through the graphic. So you need to have a hierarchy of information, things that are highlighted as more important, and then information that's kind of highlighted as secondary to that. Grouping and alignment is very important. You need to control the narrative flow. So where do people's eyes go first? And where do they go next? And what is the logic or story arc? And make that obvious, because when you're confronted with a graphic, your brain is just trying to find, like, what is my way through this? If you make that obvious, then you're helping people to understand the graphic. Simplify, so use graphics for communicating complex concepts, and remove unnecessary detail to reduce the cognitive load. And make it appealing. So your graphic should arouse curiosity and interest, and it should have some kind of hook. Why should people care about this? So people should immediately feel that sense of, I want to look at this more, and I want to find out what it's about. Let's take a look at some examples. The first example I have here is from an astrophysics publication, and it's about these particles that are ejected from a black hole, and how the researchers determined what these particles are through their research. I really like this graphic because the entry point into the graphic is really evident. You see the black hole right away, your eye is drawn to it. And then there's this line moving up towards the top right, and that line is the direction of the story, the direction that your eye is supposed to move in. And the way this is organized, that's really obvious. The color is working well. The graphic, the simplified illustration is working well. The typeface is not quite working perfectly, in my opinion. It could be integrated a bit better into the graphic, and I think that would be a matter of adjusting the color of it slightly. It seems a little bit like it's just laid on top to me, but generally this is very successful. This is an example from a biology publication. It's a kind of graphical abstract for the paper, and in this research, flies were genetically engineered so that their antennae, which normally detect odors, are receptive to light instead. So you can use a light to simulate odors in a wind. And they showed that the flies could detect which direction the odor was coming from the signal on one side of their head, from one antenna being stronger than the other. And what I love about this graphic is it tells the whole story of the research. It's got the methodology, it's got the results, but it's also really quite appealing. So you just see it and you're fascinated, you want to find out what it's about. And when you try to find out what it's about, it's easy to navigate as well. Another example from a biology publication. And in this research, they investigated a number of different sites to look for ancient environmental DNA, and just determined the concentration of DNA from different species at different sites. This is the choices that have been made in this are really good. The colors that have been chosen. It's actually very simple. It's just a grid of rectangles. You understand implicitly that gray means they didn't find any. And even without looking at the scale at the bottom, you understand that pale red means not very much DNA, and dark red means more DNA. So if I look in the middle, I see lots of red along the line Lepiropidae. And then when I look to the right, I see an image of a rabbit. So I can just immediately understand that there was lots of rabbit DNA found. And then if you look in the caption, you can see hares, leperopidae. So everything here is really clear and well organized. It was a good choice to use silhouettes rather than more complicated graphics for the animals, because they're just very rapidly perceived by the brain as to what they reference. Just going back to this slide to remind you, and just thinking about that last graphic, how the composition is effective, the colors are judicious, the typeface is good, it works well. You don't think about the typeface when it's working well, it just seems like the natural typeface you should use. The shapes and the reduction of texture have worked really well too, just going back to it, just using the silhouettes to immediately communicate those different species. Here's another example, which is a medical trial publication involving 2 different treatments for low pressure glaucoma. This is also really well laid out. The story, the overall story of this is immediately evident. You can see on the left, you have the research methodology, and in the middle as well, which shows how the participants were distributed between the different treatments. And then the research results with primary outcome and secondary outcome. And then across to the right, you have a column of what's implicitly understood to be additional information that you don't really have to read, but is there if you want to get some more information. So again, it's just compositionally organizing things leading the eye through the graphic. Good choice of color, simple colors, just different shades of blue and white and black, essentially, which is a harmonious color combination, and good typefaces. So I wanted to show this just to show that you don't have to use any really fancy design techniques to make those really good decisions that make something work and be easy to perceive. This is a diagram that I made for a research group to show the organization of a large research project and how different smaller research projects feed into the development of this research hub. So with this diagram, I tried to choose colors that represented the ethos of the project. It's about improving health outcomes. It's collaborative. It's non-hierarchical. I tried to choose a typeface that is serious, but not too serious. That kind of reflects the fact that it kind of creates a sort of accessibility for the diagram. Let's talk about some designs that are less effective and try to analyze why they're not working very well, or not working as well as they should be. This is an infographic from a book that I bought called Ancient Rome Infographics, which I'm really interested in ancient Rome and really interested in infographics, so it seemed like a natural book for me to buy. When I saw this, I was immediately confused, and it took me a while to kind of decipher, like, what is the story of this? And it turns out that it's about how the city of Rome grew over the centuries. So around the map is a kind of a graph that you have to read clockwise, and it shows the area of the city increasing. And this is not really very effective because there's nothing graphically showing the city actually getting bigger. So it would have worked a lot better to have a linear graph at the bottom, just with time versus city area. And then with these buildings at the bottom, I'm really curious about when were they built? When was the Colosseum built, for example? If you'd had this linear graph, then you could have just had arrows pointing to different parts of the graph, and that would have worked a lot better. They could have used color a little bit more effectively here. And the final critique I would have is that the graphics of the buildings are a little bit too complex for an infographic. If they were simplified a little bit more, they'd become a little bit more symbolic, which I think would be useful. Here, the colors are a little bit off-putting, in my opinion. Of course, color is subjective, and color also depends on the audience. So these kinds of bright primary colors are good if your audience is children. But even though this is an education diagram, the audience is not children, it's educators. So I think these, yes, you could use a red, you could use a blue, you could use a yellow, but which red, which blue, which yellow, not just the default ones that are suggested to you in whatever application you're using, but be a bit more judicious about what colors you choose. This is from a visual communication design book that I have, and it was actually presented as an example of something successful, but there were a few elements of this that felt a bit off to me. I think the typeface feels a little bit too whimsical, and it doesn't really integrate well. The alignment of those three elements is troubling to me as well, because the one on the right doesn't seem to be aligned with the other three, and that really bothers me when I see it. And then that yellow that's been used for the arrows and the outlines is not really working for me. So I feel like, and you don't want to have those elements that immediately cry out to say, oh, why did you do that? Because you want, in a sense, the design to be transparent, to feel natural, that people just receiving the information without noticing the kind of errors that have been made in the design. So some final tips are know your audience and design for it. So it's not one size fits all. You have to think, are you designing for the general public? Are you designing for other researchers? Are you designing for teenagers or children, for example? What background knowledge can you assume, and what types of graphics and colors will engage them? Experiment with everything, with typefaces, colors, composition, and graphics. Your initial choices are almost never the best ones. Avoid arbitrary or default typefaces and colors. Create hierarchies of information and lead the eye through the design. So the most important information is connected together to show the overall story. Then that overall story should be immediately evident. And then you can have a kind of second tier of secondary information that people can drill into if they want to. Ask people, friends and family, what they think your design conveys. They should be able to perceive the overall story arc very quickly, within 10 or 15 seconds. If they can't, then you have a problem, and you have to admit that and try to fix it. And finally, if you can get the composition, color, and typeface right and working together, then you're already 80% there. So those are really the three key elements, in my opinion. So that's all I have for you for today. I hope you found it useful, and thanks for listening.